Why does an empire die? Not from the thunder of barbarian hordes at the gates, nor from the slow poison of corruption within. An empire dies the moment it forgets how to build. How did Rome, which gave the world concrete that could harden underwater and stand for 2 millennia, lose that recipe on the very day its legions fell? How did a single forged document, the so-called Donation of Constantine, emerge from the smoking ruins to define the spiritual and political map of Europe for the next 1,000 years? The history you were taught in school is a carefully curated lie, a simplified tale of kings and battles. The true history of the Dark Ages is a story of a frantic, silent war. It was not a war for gold or territory, but for something far more valuable, the scattered, deadly fragments of a knowledge that had once built the world and had then almost destroyed it. It was a hunt for the ghost of technology, for a power that promised to either rebuild civilization or burn its ashes to glass. The year is 410. Alaric's Visigoths are in Rome. But while the mob tears at marble statues and melts down golden eagles, a different kind of plunder is underway in the shadows. In the vaulted libraries of patrician villas and the cavernous halls of the Ulpian Library, small, desperate groups of men are not fighting the invaders. They are fighting time. They are not saving jewelry. They are saving scrolls, blueprints for aqueducts that could turn deserts green, treatises on medicine that described surgical procedures not seen again until the 19th century. Star charts so accurate they hinted at a world far older than the Church would ever admit. This was the real treasure of Rome, and these men, scholars, engineers, philosophers, the last embers of a dying fire, knew it. They were the first keepers. They understood a terrifying truth. This knowledge in the hands of savages would be a weapon. But in a world descending into darkness, it was also the only hope. The operation was one of chaos and precision. While a Goth chieftain drunkenly paraded in a senator's toga, a Greek librarian, his hands shaking, would be meticulously packing a set of papyri on gear mechanics into a lead-lined chest. As the Vandals later set the city ablaze in 455, a former legionary engineer, now sworn to a secret oath, would be lowering the last schematics for a hydraulic crane into a forgotten cistern beneath the baths of Caracalla. They used the chaos as cover. They bribed barbarians with trinkets to look the other way. They encoded vital information into seemingly innocuous epic poems. They betrayed friends and sacrificed family, all for a single, desperate gamble. That one day, humanity would be worthy of this knowledge again. But could you make such a choice? What is more important, to save a life, or to save the idea that could one day save 1 million lives? The keepers made their choice, and the world would bleed for it for 1,000 years. The fragments were scattered like seeds in a hurricane. Some traveled north, sewn into the cloaks of fleeing monks, eventually finding refuge on the windswept shores of Ireland, where they would be copied and recopied in isolated scriptoriums, their true meaning slowly fading into myth. Others went east, smuggled aboard grain ships bound for Constantinople, where the Byzantine emperors would hoard them, using them to craft their devastating Greek fire and maintain a flickering echo of Roman glory. Some of the most dangerous texts, those dealing with human anatomy and chemistry, were buried deep beneath Rome itself in the catacombs, entrusted to mystery cults that had survived the rise of Christianity. The world above was fragmenting into 100 squabbling kingdoms, but the world below was a library of ticking bombs. The Dark Ages were not empty. They were waiting. Empires are built on concrete and laws, but they crumble because of a single word whispered in the wrong corridor. The keepers knew this. Their goal was not just to hide the knowledge, but to hide the memory that it had ever existed. They helped cultivate the myth of a golden age, a lost Atlantis, a time of giants. It was safer for people to believe in magic than to know that their ancestors had possessed a science they could no longer comprehend. The loss had to be absolute, a total system wipe, so that humanity could start over, slowly, painfully relearning the basics. They traded progress for survival, a choice that seems monstrous to us now, but for a man watching the light of civilization flicker and die, It was the only sane option. The knowledge was not lost, it was quarantined, but you cannot quarantine an idea forever. Even in the deepest darkness, rumors persist. Whispers of books that could tell the future, of powders that could heal any wound, of metals that could cut through iron like wood. These whispers became the foundation of myth, the fuel for legend. The stories of Excalibur, the Holy Grail, the Philosopher's Stone, what were they really? Not tales of magic, but the distorted, half-remembered echoes of a science that had become indistinguishable from sorcery. The hunt had begun before the last Roman fire was even cold, and the first to organize the search were not kings or warlords, but an institution that understood that true power lies not in armies, but in controlling what people believe. The game was afoot, and its first move would be the most audacious forgery in human history. The great secret of power is that it does not exist. It is a story we agree to believe. And in the chaos that followed Rome's collapse, there was no story left. The barbarian kings ruled by the sword, their kingdoms rising and falling in a single generation. There was no authority, no law, no center. It was into this vacuum that a new power stepped, armed not with legions, but with a narrative. The Bishop of Rome, the inheritor of a persecuted faith, began to weave a new tale. A tale of one God, one church, and one earthly representative. But to make this story real, they needed a foundation. They needed a link to the glory of the fallen empire. They needed a miracle. And when miracles are in short supply, you manufacture one. The age of faith was about to be built on the most spectacular lie ever told. This fragile new order, desperate to legitimize itself, needed a foundation of unquestionable authority. It was a problem of branding, of marketing. How do you convince brutal Frankish warlords and scheming Lombard dukes that a priest in a ruined city held a power greater than their own? You don't. You show them a document stamped with the seal of the greatest emperor of all, Constantine the Great. Sometime in the 8th century, a manuscript appeared in the papal chancery. It was written in the language of power, the bureaucratic Latin of the late empire. It told a fantastic story that Emperor Constantine, cured of leprosy by Pope Sylvester I, had, in gratitude, granted the Pope and his successors dominion over Rome, Italy, and all the provinces of the Western Roman Empire. It was called the Constitutum Donatio Constantini, the donation of Constantine. And it was a complete and utter fraud. So who would you trust with the future of the world? The scattered few trying to preserve a dangerous knowledge they barely understand, or the centralized power promising a safe, controlled survival in ignorance? Let us know in the comments which side you would choose. The genius of the donation was not in its prose, but in its audacity. In an age of rampant illiteracy where a man's word was his bond and a written document was akin to a sacred relic, who could challenge it? For centuries, no one did. It became the legal cornerstone of papal supremacy. It justified the coronation of Charlemagne. It was used to demand tribute from kings and to excommunicate emperors. It was a weapon forged from ink and parchment, more powerful than any sword because it conquered the mind. But what if its true purpose was not the acquisition of land, but the acquisition of information? What if the donation was not just a power grab, but the master key to a continent-spanning treasure hunt? By claiming to be the legal heir to the Roman Empire, the papacy was also claiming ownership of its greatest secret, the hidden libraries, the scattered archives, the quarantined knowledge of the keepers. The forgery gave the church the ultimate search warrant. Papal legates, cardinals, and humble monks fanned out across Europe. Officially, their mission was to spread the faith, to standardize liturgy, to enforce canon law. Unofficially, they were intelligence agents. They were archivists of the apocalypse. They moved through the scriptoriums of Irish monasteries, praising the monks for their piety, while their sharp eyes scanned the illuminated manuscripts for any hint of pre-Christian geometry or astronomy. They negotiated with Lombard dukes for territory, but the fine print of the treaties often included the transfer of old Roman villas and their libraries. They established monasteries on ancient pagan sites, not just to sanctify the ground, but to excavate it. A shadow war began, fought not in battlefields but in the dusty silence of libraries. On one side, the centralized, organized power of the Vatican. On the other, the decentralized, secretive cells of the keeper's descendants, who had spent centuries guarding their fragments. The Vatican's agents were relentless. They were the world's first true intelligence agency, with a network that spanned the known world. They employed cryptographers to break the codes the first keepers had used. They employed scholars to distinguish authentic scientific texts from Gnostic heresy. And they employed assassins to deal with those who would not part with their secrets willingly. Many a hermit scholar found tending his hidden library in some forgotten mountain valley met with a sudden, tragic accident. Many a monastery that was too slow to hand over its collection of pagan texts found itself suddenly accused of heresy, its library confiscated for safekeeping in Rome. The wealth of the Vatican grew, but it was not a wealth of gold, it was a wealth of data. They were reassembling the lost operating system of civilization, piece by painful piece, but some fragments had traveled too far, fallen into hands too strong to be coerced by a papal bull or a quiet knife in the dark. While the Pope's agents were meticulously cataloguing Roman engineering texts in the climate-controlled vaults beneath the Lateran Palace, one of the most dangerous pieces of knowledge had found a new home in the icy north. It was a secret of fire and steel, a recipe for a metal so pure, so strong, it seemed to be forged by the gods themselves. The Vatican's search parties, pushing into the wild lands of the Saxons and the Danes, began to send back terrifying reports. Reports of pagan savages who wielded swords of impossible quality. Swords that could cleave an iron helmet in two without dulling. Swords that bore a strange, mystical inscription, plus VLFBERH plus T. The keepers had lost control of a crucial piece of military technology, and the men who now possessed it were about to unleash an age of terror upon the world. They were the Vikings. The North Sea in the 9th century was a cold, grey purgatory. It was a world of fog, ice, and sudden, brutal violence. Out of that fog came the dragon ships. To the monks of Lindisfarne, to the merchants of Dorestad, they were a divine punishment, a demonic scourge. But the terror of the Vikings was not born of brute force alone. It was born of a technological edge so profound it might as well have been magic. At the heart of this edge was the Ulfberht sword. Over 170 of these blades have been found, scattered from Ireland to Russia. For decades, historians dismissed them as the work of a single legendary smith. But modern metallurgical analysis has revealed a terrifying secret. The steel of an Ulfberht sword is crucible steel containing an incredibly high carbon content and almost no impurities or slag. To produce steel of this quality requires heating iron ore to a temperature of 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. This level of technology, this purity of metal, would not be seen again in Europe until the Industrial Revolution nearly 1,000 years later. So where did a society with no written tradition of its own, a people dismissed by the rest of Europe as illiterate barbarians, acquire this advanced knowledge? The chronicles are silent. The sagas speak of swords forged by dwarfs and quenched in dragon's blood, but the truth is likely more prosaic and far more frightening. A single Roman scroll detailing the complex processes of metallurgy learned from India or Persia must have made its way north. Perhaps it was traded for amber, perhaps it was stolen in a raid, perhaps it was carried by a single fugitive keeper. However it arrived, it fell into the hands of Frankish and Norse smiths who, through generations of trial and error, turned a theoretical text into a production line of superweapons. The plus VLFBERH plus T inscription was not a maker's name, it was a brand, a mark of quality, the medieval equivalent of a patent that guaranteed its wielder a devastating advantage on the battlefield. And it was not just their steel. How did the Vikings navigate the treacherous open waters of the North Atlantic, reaching Iceland, Greenland, and even North America 500 years before Columbus? The sagas speak of a solarstein, a sunstone. For centuries, this was dismissed as myth. But we now know this was likely a piece of calcite or Iceland spar, a crystal common in Scandinavia. When you hold this crystal up to the sky, it polarizes the light, allowing you to find the exact position of the sun, even on a completely overcast day. It is a simple, elegant, and brutally effective compass. A surviving fragment of ancient optics, a sliver of the knowledge of light and lenses that had been perfected in the Library of Alexandria, had become the global positioning system of the Viking Age. They were not magicians, they were engineers armed with a stolen legacy. Their raids were not random acts of savagery, they were targeted missions guided by a technological supremacy that allowed them to strike with impunity. With their sunstones, they could cross open oceans that trapped other sailors within sight of the coast. With their shallow draft longships, they could sail up rivers deep into the heart of Europe. And with their Ulfbert swords, a single Viking warrior could face multiple, more heavily armored opponents and emerge victorious. They were a force of nature, but a force enabled by a science they did not fully understand. The knowledge gave them power, but it also made them a target. The Emperor of Byzantium, the Caliph of Baghdad, the Pope in Rome, everyone wanted the secret to their steel. Frankish kings like Charles the Bald made it a capital offense to sell these swords to the Vikings, a desperate act of arms control that utterly failed. The knowledge was out. The curse was spreading. The age of Viking terror eventually faded. They settled, they converted, they became the Normans of France, the Rus of Kiev, the traders of Dublin. Their technological edge was slowly eroded as other powers caught up. But the lesson was not lost on the leaders of Christendom. A single piece of recovered knowledge could change the balance of power overnight. This realization ignited a new kind of fever in Europe. The hunt for the lost archives of the ancients became an obsession, and the focus of that obsession turned to one place, the city where so many threads of history and faith converged, a place where the greatest treasures of the ancient world were rumored to lie buried: Jerusalem. The stage was set for the greatest and most violent treasure hunt in history, the Crusades. A new kind of warrior was needed for this task, a warrior who could fight, but who could also read, dig, and, most importantly, keep a secret. A warrior monk. In the year 1999, after a brutal siege, the armies of the First Crusade captured Jerusalem. The holy city was awash in blood, a chaotic scene of religious fervor and savage plunder. But amidst this chaos, a small, unassuming group of 9 knights, led by a nobleman named Hugues de Payan, did something strange. They did not join the looting, they did not seek land or titles. Instead, they presented themselves to the new king of Jerusalem, Baldwin II, and made a simple vow to protect the pilgrim routes to the Holy Land. The king granted them a headquarters, a wing of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, a site that stood upon the ruins of a far more ancient structure, the Temple of Solomon. For 9 years, these 9 knights did very little patrolling. They recruited no new members. They were, by all accounts, incredibly poor. And yet they spent their days and nights on the Temple Mount. They were not guarding pilgrims, they were digging. What were they looking for? Legends say it was the Ark of the Covenant, or the Holy Grail, but the true target was likely far more tangible. Jerusalem was a crossroads of civilizations. It had been conquered by the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans. Before the Romans destroyed the Second Temple in the year 70, it was one of the greatest centers of learning in the ancient world. It is highly probable that when the threat of Rome loomed, the temple priests, like the keepers in Rome centuries later, hid their most sacred and dangerous texts. Not just religious scrolls, but records of history, science, architecture, and finance. The Order of the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, soon to be known simply as the Knights Templar, were not founded to be a holy police force. They were a state-sponsored archaeological expedition with a single, secret objective: to recover the knowledge hidden beneath the Temple Mount. Around the year 1128, something changed. The Templars, after 9 years of obscurity, suddenly exploded onto the world stage. Bernard of Clairvaux, the most powerful and influential churchman of his day, wrote a passionate treatise in their favor, and suddenly donations poured in from across Christendom. The Pope officially recognized their order. Young noblemen flocked to join their ranks. The poor knights were suddenly the wealthiest and most powerful organization in the world, subordinate only to the Pope himself. What happened in those 9 years of digging? They must have found something that gave them immense leverage. Perhaps it was a cache of documents, a library of knowledge that dwarfed anything held in Europe. This knowledge was the source of their power. Their public face was one of piety and military prowess. But their true genius lay elsewhere. Using the knowledge they had unearthed, perhaps texts on logistics, mathematics, and economics, they created the world's first multinational corporation and international banking system. A pilgrim could deposit his money at the Templar Preceptory in London and receive a letter of credit written in a complex cipher, which he could then cash at the Templar headquarters in Jerusalem. They became the bankers for popes and kings. They financed wars. They owned vast tracts of land, farms, vineyards, and even their own fleet of ships. They were more than soldiers. They were the logistical and financial backbone of the medieval world. Their power was not based on prayer, but on information. A dangerous, secret information that they guarded jealously, but knowledge that grants power also inspires fear. By the turn of the 14th century, the Templars were a state within a state, their influence eclipsing that of any monarch. King Philip IV of France, deeply in their debt and deeply paranoid of their power, decided to act. He saw not a holy order, but a secret society that possessed a power he could not control. In league with the Pope, he effectively held captive, Philip planned the most ambitious and brutal special forces operation of the Middle Ages. On Friday, October the 13th, 1307, sealed orders were opened simultaneously across France. Every Templar in the kingdom was to be arrested, their properties seized, their assets frozen. The charges were heresy, blasphemy, unspeakable crimes. The goal was not justice, it was annihilation. It was a hostile takeover designed to seize not just their gold, but the source of their power, their archive. The raid was a stunning success. Thousands of knights were arrested, subjected to horrific torture, and forced to confess to fabricated crimes. The Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was slowly burned at the stake in Paris. But in the most crucial aspect, the operation was a catastrophic failure. The Templars' main treasure, their vast archives and the bulk of their immense wealth, was never found. On the eve of the arrests, legend says, the Templar fleet slipped quietly out of the port of La Rochelle, laden with their true treasure, and vanished into the Atlantic. The knowledge had once again gone to ground. The hunt was back on, but the trail was cold. The greatest prize, the secret that had built the Templar Empire, was gone. What do you believe the Templars really were? Guardians of a sacred trust, protectors of a knowledge that could rebuild the world? Or were they power-hungry heretics who amassed wealth and influence until they were rightly destroyed? Share your verdict in the comments. The disappearance of the Templar fleet is one of history's great unsolved mysteries. Where did they go? Scotland, Portugal, America? The truth is we don't know, but it is possible that not all of the treasure was on those ships. Some of it, perhaps the most dangerous, non-material parts of the archive, the philosophy, the theology, the concepts that threatened the very foundation of the Roman Church, may have been entrusted to allies on the continent, allies who lived in the rich, independent and notoriously unorthodox lands of southern France, a people who called themselves the bons hommes, the good men. The world would come to know them as the Cathars, and the Church would come to brand them the most dangerous heretics in history. A purifying fire was about to be unleashed. The region of Languedoc in the 12th and 13th centuries was an anomaly in Europe. It was a land of poets, troubadours, and independent-minded nobles. It was a place where tolerance was the norm and where a sophisticated, vibrant culture flourished. And it was here that the Cathar faith took root. Theirs was not a simple protest against papal corruption. It was a fundamentally different cosmology. They believed the material world, the world of flesh, stone, and power, was an evil creation, the work of a lesser, malevolent god. The true God, the God of love and light, was entirely spiritual. This dualism made them uniquely suited to be keepers of a dangerous secret. For them, a physical text or an artifact was worthless. The only thing that mattered was the gnosis, the pure knowledge itself. This made them both the perfect guardians and the ultimate threat to a church built on physical relics, golden cathedrals, and worldly power. The Vatican, already reeling from the Templar affair and pathologically afraid of any rival source of knowledge, saw the Cathars as a cancer that had to be excised. In 1209, Pope Innocent III launched the Albigensian Crusade. It was the first time a crusade had been declared against fellow Christians, and it was prosecuted with a ferocity that shocked even that brutal age. The papal legate, when asked how to distinguish Catholics from heretics at the siege of Béziers, is said to have uttered the infamous words, "Kill them all, God will know his own." This was not a war of conversion, it was a war of extermination, a campaign to wipe a culture, a people, and an idea from the face of the earth. The armies of the north, led by the ruthless Simon de Montfort, swept through Languedoc, leaving a trail of fire and slaughter. The true target was not just the people, but the knowledge they protected. For 40 years the war raged. The castles of the Cathar nobles fell one by one. The final act of this tragedy took place in the spring of 1244 at the Eagle's Nest fortress of Montségur, a seemingly impregnable castle perched atop a sheer rock peak in the Pyrenees. Here, the last of the Cathar leadership, the perfects, the initiated elite of their faith, held out against a besieging army of 10,000 men. The siege lasted for 10 months. It was a brutal, desperate affair. But as starvation and despair set in, the defenders knew the end was near. On the night before the final surrender, something extraordinary happened. While the French army prepared for its final assault, 4 Cathar perfects were lowered down the sheer 1,000-foot cliff face on ropes. They carried with them, it was said, the Cathar treasure. When the fortress finally fell, over 200 Cathar perfects who refused to renounce their faith were burned alive in a massive pyre at the foot of the mountain. The Crusaders ransacked the castle, but they found no gold, no silver, no jewels. The treasure was gone. The 4 fugitives had vanished into the mountain wilderness, taking with them the last secret of their faith. What was this treasure? It was almost certainly not material wealth. It was a book, a scroll, a collection of texts. Perhaps it was part of the Templar archive. Perhaps it was something even older. Whatever it was knowledge so dangerous, so subversive, that the Church and the French crown were willing to commit genocide to possess or destroy it. The secret survived, but it was driven deeper underground, into the shadows. Its keepers were now hunted fugitives, and their knowledge was becoming fragmented, coded, and transformed into something new. The age of open heresy was over. The age of alchemy had begun. In the wake of the Cathar Crusade, Europe became a paranoid, dangerous place for anyone who thought differently. The Inquisition was established, a finely tuned machine for detecting and suppressing dissent. The open pursuit of knowledge that contradicted church dogma became a death sentence, but you cannot kill a human being's thirst to understand. The quest did not end. It simply changed its language. The keepers of the fragments could no longer be philosophers or theologians. They became alchemists. In secret laboratories, in the cellars of great cities and the towers of isolated castles, a new clandestine war for knowledge was being waged. Its public face was the great work, the quest to transmute base metals into gold and to discover the elixir of life, the philosopher's stone. But was this the true goal, or was it a brilliant cover story? Alchemy, with its mystical language of green lions, red kings, and philosophical mercury, seems like pure superstition to us. But what if it was a form of reverse engineering? What if the alchemists were not charlatans, but desperate scientists working with corrupted data? Imagine being given a single, scorched page from a modern chemistry textbook. You might not be able to reconstruct the entire science, but you could try to decipher the symbols to replicate the experiments described. The alchemical process, the endless cycle of dissolving, filtering, and heating, may have been a brute force attempt to rediscover the lost science of the ancients based on fragmented allegorical texts. The quest for gold was not about wealth, it was a benchmark. If you could rearrange the structure of lead into gold, you had proven you understood the fundamental laws of matter. You had rediscovered the key. Figures like Nicolas Flamel, the legendary Parisian alchemist, were said to have succeeded. The story goes that he came into possession of a mysterious, ancient book filled with strange diagrams, and after years of work, he and his wife, Perenella, unlocked the secret of the stone, achieved immortality, and became fantastically wealthy. Is this true? Almost certainly not, but Flamel was a real person, a scrivener who did become inexplicably wealthy. Perhaps he did not find the secret to immortality, but a fragment of knowledge relating to metallurgy or chemistry or even finance that allowed him to amass a fortune. The legend was a necessary camouflage in an age when the Inquisition would burn you for possessing a book on anatomy. Claiming you were seeking a mythical substance was the only way to conduct real research. The alchemist's laboratory was not a wizard's den, it was a battlefield of the mind. And it was a deadly battlefield. The hunt for knowledge had not stopped. The agents of the church, the spies of kings, and ruthless private collectors were all desperate to get their hands on any alchemical text, any successful practitioner. The life of an alchemist was one of constant paranoia. A sudden knock on the door at midnight could be the Inquisition, come to seize your work and stretch you on the rack. Your own apprentice might be a spy, waiting to murder you and steal your secrets. Experiments could go wrong, ending in a blinding flash and a plume of poison gas. Every alchemist knew they were dancing on a knife's edge, caught between the promise of ultimate knowledge and the reality of a brutal, agonizing death. The pressure was immense. And under this pressure, some of the keepers decided that the old ways of hiding knowledge, burying it, encoding it in poems, dressing it in allegory, were no longer enough. A new method was needed, an ultimate encryption. After centuries of being hunted, after seeing libraries burned and orders exterminated, the remaining cells of keepers came to a stark conclusion. Any code could be broken, any language could be translated, any hiding place could be found. As long as knowledge was recorded in a form that was meant to be understood, it was vulnerable. So they embarked on their most audacious project yet. They would create an archive that was, by its very design, completely and utterly incomprehensible. It would not be a message in a bottle, it would be the bottle itself, a vessel of perfect security, a book that held its secrets not in its text, but in its very insolubility. It is an artifact that has been called the Everest of cryptography, a mystery that has broken the greatest minds for centuries. We know it today as the Voynich manuscript. Discovered in 1912 by an antique book dealer named Wilfrid Voynich, the manuscript is a small, unassuming codex of about 240 pages, but from the moment you open it, you are plunged into a world of profound and unsettling strangeness. It is filled with elegant handwritten script in an unknown alphabet that flows with the natural rhythm of a real language, yet it obeys no known linguistic pattern. It contains no errors, no corrections, and statistical analysis shows it has a structure too complex to be a simple hoax. It is a language that seems to exist outside of human history, and the illustrations are even more bizarre. There are botanical drawings of plants that do not exist on Earth, their flowers and root systems unlike anything in our botany. There are astronomical charts of constellations we cannot identify, filled with intricate, alien-looking zodiacs, and most famously there are the pages filled with drawings of naked women bathing in elaborate, interconnected green pools and plumbing systems, a biological or alchemical process that remains utterly opaque. For over a century, the manuscript has resisted every attempt at decipherment. It was studied by the legendary cryptographers who broke the Enigma code during World War II. They failed. It has been analysed by supercomputers, linguists, botanists, and historians. They have all failed. The book is a perfect enigma. It taunts us. It feels like it is on the verge of revealing a profound secret, but the door remains locked. What is it? A lost language? The ravings of a madman? An elaborate practical joke, or is it exactly what it was designed to be, the ultimate safe? Perhaps it was created in the court of the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II in Prague, a known haven for alchemists, mystics, and scholars on the run from the Inquisition. Perhaps it is a compilation of all the dangerous knowledge the keepers had left, translated into a unique, unbreakable cipher, a one-time pad for a lost civilization. The manuscript represents the culmination of the medieval war on knowledge. It is the final, desperate act of hiding. The keepers, facing extinction, created a time capsule they themselves might not have been able to reopen. The key, if one ever existed, is lost. The knowledge is sealed away, perfectly preserved and perfectly useless. The manuscript is a monument to a terrifying idea, that some knowledge is so dangerous it is better to lock it away forever than to risk it falling into the wrong hands. It is the ultimate expression of the Keeper's Creed. But it is also a curse. It has driven some of its researchers to madness, others to obsession and ruin. It is an intellectual black hole, consuming all theories and offering nothing in return. It is a silent testament to the fact that the greatest secrets are the ones we can see but never understand. Is it better to leave a mystery like the Voynich manuscript unsolved, a beautiful and terrifying question mark in our history? Or should we risk everything to find the answer, even if that answer could unleash the very knowledge its creators tried so desperately to hide? Tell us in the comments if you would choose the mystery or the answer. But not all secrets can be contained in a book. Some are not written in ink, but in flesh and blood. Sometimes the smooth, predictable surface of history cracks, and for a brief moment, we glimpse something inexplicable hiding underneath. These are the stories that are quickly dismissed as folklore, the footnotes in chronicles that historians prefer to ignore because they fit no established narrative. They are glitches in the matrix of the medieval world, anomalies that suggest the universe was stranger and more terrifying than the Church's tidy cosmology would allow. And they serve as a chilling reminder that sometimes the products of lost knowledge don't stay buried in vaults or encrypted in manuscripts. Sometimes they walk out of the woods and into our world. In the middle of the 12th century, during the reign of King Stephen, the small English village of Woolpit in Suffolk became the centre of one of history's most enduring and unsettling mysteries. Two chroniclers of the time, Ralph of Coggeshall and William of Newburgh, recorded the event in detail. One day, villagers working in the fields heard strange cries coming from one of the deep pits dug to trap wolves. When they investigated, they found two children, a boy and a girl, huddled in terror. They were dressed in strange, unfamiliar clothing, spoke a language no one could understand, and, most unnervingly, their skin was a distinct shade of green. They were brought to the home of a local landowner, but they refused all food, seemingly starving, until they were offered raw broad beans, which they devoured eagerly. The boy, sickly and melancholic, died within a year. But the girl survived. She was baptized, gradually lost her green pallor, and learned to speak English. When she was able to tell her story, it only deepened the mystery. She claimed that she and her brother had come from a place called the Land of St. Martin, an underground world where it was always twilight and all the inhabitants were green. She said they had been herding their father's flock when they heard a loud noise, like bells, and followed it through a cave, emerging into the blinding sunlight of Woolpit. She could not explain how to get back. The girl, later named Agnes, grew up, married, and integrated into the community. The story of the green children of Woolpit became a local legend, a piece of charming folklore. But what was it really? Was it a simple folk tale, a garbled account of lost Flemish immigrant children suffering from malnutrition? This is the rational explanation. Or was it something else? In a world where secret groups were desperately trying to reconstruct a lost science, what kind of experiments might have been taking place in some hidden, underground laboratory? Could the children have been the result of some bizarre alchemical or biological experiment that went wrong? Was their underground land a description of a vast subterranean shelter, a remnant of an older civilization? The story is a fracture in reality. It is a data point that does not fit. And like all such anomalies, the official story of the world quickly moved to seal the crack. Agnes became a normal woman. The green skin was explained away as a dietary issue. The story became a quaint tale for children. The system protected itself. Throughout the medieval period, the chronicles are littered with these moments of high strangeness. Reports of fiery shields in the sky over castles, of strange beasts that defy classification, of mysterious plagues that appeared and vanished as if by design. Each one was a potential breach, a moment where the carefully constructed reality of the medieval world was threatened by something it could not explain. And each time, the forces of order, the church, the state, moved to contain it, to explain it away, to turn it into a miracle, a demonic manifestation, or a simple peasant superstition. The blank spaces on the maps marked "Here be dragons" were not just a confession of ignorance. They were a warning. They were a quarantine zone for reality itself. But in the middle of the 14th century, a breach occurred that was so vast, so catastrophic, that no chronicle could contain it, no explanation could soften it. A dragon was coming, and it would devour half the world. It began as a rumor from the Far East, a whisper carried along the Silk Road. A pestilence of unimaginable virulence was sweeping through China and Central Asia. Then, in October of 1347, 12 Genoese trading galleys, fleeing from a siege in the Crimea, limped into the harbour at Messina, Sicily. The townspeople who greeted them were met with a horrific sight. Most of the sailors aboard were either dead or dying, their bodies covered in black boils that oozed blood and pus. The Sicilian authorities, in a panic, ordered the death ships out of the harbour, but it was too late. The sickness was ashore. Within 5 years, the Black Death would kill between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire population of Europe. It was the single greatest catastrophe in human history, an event so apocalyptic it shattered the medieval world forever. The plague's progress was relentless and terrifyingly efficient. It did not behave like a normal disease. It traveled faster than the pace of human movement, seeming to leap from town to town. It took multiple forms: the bubonic plague, spread by fleas on rats, which was agonizingly painful but survivable for some, and the pneumonic plague, which spread through the air from person to person and had a mortality rate of nearly 100%. Society collapsed. Parents abandoned their children. Priests refused to give last rites. The living barely had time to bury the dead, digging vast plague pits where bodies were piled up like firewood. The psychological impact was even more profound. The world, it seemed, was ending. God had either abandoned humanity or was punishing it with a fury that beggared belief. In the midst of the horror and chaos, the search for a cause became frantic. The medical faculty at the University of Paris blamed a conjunction of 3 planets. Others blamed earthquakes releasing poisonous vapors or a corrupt atmosphere. But on the streets, among the terrified populace, another theory took hold. This was no natural event. This was a deliberate act of malice. The wells had been poisoned. The plague was a conspiracy. Mobs, desperate for a scapegoat, attacked and massacred Jewish communities, lepers and foreigners, accusing them of spreading the disease. These were the desperate acts of a terrified people. But what if, for once, the conspiracy theorists were right? Consider the context. For centuries, secret societies had been warring over the fragments of ancient knowledge. What if one of these factions had finally found what it was looking for? Not a text on engineering or astronomy, but a treatise on biology, on the manipulation of life itself. What if, in a desperate bid for power, they had decided to use this knowledge as a weapon? Unleashing a tailored, engineered plague upon their rivals, never imagining that it would rage so far out of their control. It's a monstrous thought, but the plague's strange behavior, its incredible lethality and speed, led many at the time to believe it was something more than nature. It felt directed, intelligent. It was the world's first biological war, a war that no one won, a weapon that had turned on its creators and consumed the world. The ultimate secret had been unleashed, and it was the secret of death itself. The old world died in the plague pits of the 14th century. The rigid feudal system, the unquestioned authority of the church, the very foundations of medieval society, all were washed away in a tide of death. But out of this unimaginable destruction, something new was struggling to be born. The survivors of the apocalypse found themselves in a strange new world. Labor was scarce, wages were high, and the old certainties were gone. The psychological slate had been wiped clean. For the keepers of the knowledge, those who had survived the plague, this was a moment of terrible reckoning. Their secret war had brought the world to its knees. Their hunt for power had culminated in a global graveyard. A choice had to be made: to continue the war, to keep hoarding their secrets until nothing was left but ashes, or to try a new strategy. A secret pact was made. In the quiet chaos of the post-plague world, the leaders of the rival factions, the descendants of the Templars, the Gnostic cells that survived the Cathar Crusade, the enlightened alchemists, the secret humanist societies, came to an agreement. The old way had failed. The knowledge was too powerful to be wielded as a weapon, too dangerous to be hoarded by any one group. Hiding it had only led to stagnation and disaster. They decided on a radical new course of action, a controlled release. They would carefully, deliberately reintroduce some of the lost knowledge back into the world. Not the secrets of weapons or mass control, but the knowledge of art, architecture, science, and philosophy. They would not give humanity a sword, they would give it a paintbrush and a compass. It was a plan to manufacture a renaissance. The operation needed a headquarters and a source of funding. They chose the bustling city-states of northern Italy, particularly Florence. And they chose a family of ambitious bankers, shrewd and discreet, to be their public face, the Medici. The Medici family's sudden and meteoric rise from obscure wool merchants to the de facto rulers of Florence and the bankers of the papacy has always been something of a mystery. What if their success was not just due to their business acumen, but because they were being secretly funded and guided by this new secret alliance? The Medici Bank became the financial engine of the Renaissance, channeling vast sums of money not into armies, but into art and science. They became patrons, sponsoring a generation of geniuses who would change the world forever. Think of the giants of the Renaissance. Leonardo da Vinci, the ultimate polymath, whose notebooks are filled with designs for flying machines, submarines, and anatomical drawings of breathtaking accuracy, centuries ahead of their time. Where did he get these ideas? Was it pure, unaided genius, or was he given access to a secret library of ancient texts? Filippo Brunelleschi, the architect who solved the unsolvable problem of building the giant dome on the Florence Cathedral, a feat of engineering not seen since the construction of the Pantheon in Rome. How did he rediscover the principles of classical architecture and engineering? Was he, too, guided by a hidden hand? Michelangelo, Botticelli, Donatello, their work represented a sudden, explosive return to a classical realism and humanism that had been dormant for 1,000 years. It was not a rebirth, it was an excavation. The Renaissance was the greatest public relations campaign in history. It was a carefully managed, controlled leak of quarantined information. The alliance of keepers fed their chosen geniuses with just enough knowledge to push society forward, to pull Europe out of the mud of the Middle Ages, but not enough to give them the power to destroy themselves again. The most dangerous knowledge, the secrets of energy, of biology, of the human mind, remained hidden. They gave us beautiful paintings and magnificent buildings, but they kept the keys to the kingdom for themselves. They created our modern world, but they built it on a foundation of secrets. They ended the Dark Ages by deciding, for us, what we were ready to know. And so the 1,000-year war for knowledge ended not with a bang, but with a quiet conspiracy for progress. The story we were told of a natural awakening from a long slumber is a comforting fiction. The truth is that our civilization was rebooted deliberately and secretly. The knowledge that once built Rome and then nearly destroyed the world was finally tamed, curated, and returned to us in a carefully controlled dosage. But the rest of it, the most powerful and terrifying parts, is still out there, hidden, waiting. A silent legacy that shapes our world in ways we can never see. They built for us a beautiful golden cage of curated knowledge, believing it would keep us safe. But others would argue that true progress only comes from dangerous freedom, the right to know everything, no matter the cost. What would you choose for humanity? Tell us your choice in the comments. The answer matters more than you think.